Have you ever thought you knew everything about the people around you? Their secrets? Their hidden lives? Well, what if I told you that there's a secret buried so deep that, when it finally comes to light, it will leave you in complete shock? Meet Leila, a shy, quiet African woman working as a domestic worker in a rich, powerful Arab executive's mansion. He's married, but every time his wife steps out, his eyes are on her. For years, Leila avoids his advances, until one day, everything changes. But what happens when the tables turn? When the consequences of a hidden affair become bigger than anyone expected? Leila didn't just walk away, she walked away with a secret that could ruin his life. Years later, he finds out the truth, and it's nothing like he could have imagined. Stay with us until the end to discover the shocking twist that will leave everyone speechless. Leila had always been a quiet, reserved woman. She never sought attention, preferring the company of her thoughts over the chaos of the world. Born in a small, humble village in Africa, she had come to America seeking a better life, but the reality had proven far more complicated. Working as a domestic worker for the wealthy Arab executive, Hassan al-Mansour was not the dream she had envisioned, but it provided a roof over her head and food on the table. Hassan was a man of power, charm, and wealth. A successful businessman who commanded respect in every room he entered, his presence was often overwhelming. His mansion, located in an exclusive area of the city, was both a symbol of his status and his need for privacy. Leila spent her days cleaning the massive house, preparing meals, and running errands. Every now and then, she would catch glimpses of Hassan, always dressed immaculately, walking through the grand halls, his gaze intense. She had always respected him from a distance. He was her employer, after all, and there was no room for familiarity. Yet, despite the boundaries she carefully maintained, Leila couldn't help but notice how often he seemed to linger near her. Whether it was in the kitchen, where she prepared meals, or in the hallway as she cleaned, Hassan's eyes never strayed far from her, and while she avoided his gaze, she could always feel it on her back, weighing her down. Hassan was married to Nadia, a strikingly beautiful woman who was constantly occupied with social events and charity functions. Nadia was the epitome of grace and elegance, always in the spotlight. But despite her beauty and high society status, Leila couldn't help but feel that Nadia wasn't truly seen by her husband. She was busy with her own life, and Hassan seemed distant, absorbed in his work and his own desires. One afternoon, as Leila worked in the large modern kitchen, chopping vegetables for the evening meal, she felt a sudden presence behind her. She froze, her hands trembling for a moment. It was Hassan. He had come into the kitchen unnoticed, and she hadn't heard him approach. His cologne was sharp, distinct, and his proximity made her feel uneasy. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "Leila," he finally spoke, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "You work so hard. Every day. You deserve a break." Leila could feel her heart race. She nodded, continuing to chop the vegetables, hoping that her movements would distract her from the tension growing between them. "I don't think I've ever thanked you properly for everything you do around here," Hassan continued, stepping closer, his gaze not leaving her. "You're so dedicated, so silent." His words weren't harmful, but there was something in the way he said them that made Leila feel exposed. She turned slightly, trying to maintain her composure. "It's my job, Mr. Al-Mansour. It's what I do." Hassan smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Call me Hassan. We're not so different, are we?" Leila stiffened. She couldn't allow herself to think like this. She had too much respect for his wife, Nadia, and she had always told herself to remain professional. But something in the way Hassan said her name made her feel as though he was breaking through the walls she had so carefully constructed. "I should finish this," Leila said quickly, turning back to the cutting board, trying to dismiss the conversation. But Hassan didn't back away. Instead, he reached out, gently touching her arm. The contact was brief, but enough to send a shiver down her spine. Leila flinched and immediately pulled her arm away. Her breath caught in her throat. "Leila," he whispered, stepping closer, his voice now lower, almost seductive. "You don't need to be so distant. I know you feel the same way." Leila turned sharply, her eyes wide with shock. "What are you talking about?" "You can't hide it." Hassan's voice dropped, his face now inches from hers. "I've seen the way you look at me, the way you avoid me. It's because you want this just as much as I do." Leila's heart was pounding now, her body frozen in place. She wanted to scream, to run, but she found herself unable to move. She had worked so hard to avoid this moment, to keep her distance, and yet, here it was, right in front of her. "Hassan, I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're married, and I respect your wife." His lips curled into a smile, but it was not one of kindness. It was calculated, like a predator cornering its prey. "Respect, yes, but that doesn't change what's between us, does it?" He stepped even closer, his breath hot against her neck. "I can make you feel things you've never felt before, Leila. You don't have to be so afraid." A cold chill ran down her spine as his hand reached out to touch her cheek. For a brief moment, Leila considered running, but she was trapped. Trapped in his gaze, trapped by the situation she found herself in. I need to leave," Leila stammered, finally breaking away from him. "I have work to do." But Hassan was insistent. "Stay. Just a little longer," he whispered, his voice almost pleading. For a split second, she felt herself wavering. But no, she had to stay strong. She had to maintain control. She turned quickly, walking out of the kitchen without looking back. As Leila retreated to her small room at the back of the house, her heart was racing. She couldn't believe what had just happened. She had always been careful, always kept her distance, but somehow Hassan had crossed a line. She couldn't shake the feeling of his touch lingering on her skin. The days that followed felt like a blur for Leila. Every moment in the house seemed heavier, like the walls were closing in on her. She couldn't escape the memory of Hassan's touch, his voice, the way he had made her feel as though she was nothing more than an object to be possessed. She had always prided herself on her ability to maintain control, to keep a professional distance, but that brief encounter in the kitchen had shattered everything she thought she knew about herself. Her mind kept returning to the moment when Hassan had cornered her, the way his words had seemed to seep into her soul, like a poison she couldn't avoid. His insistence, his presence, were like an invisible force that pulled her closer to him every time he spoke. Despite her best efforts to distance herself, she felt an undeniable pull, one that terrified her. But she had to stay strong. She couldn't let herself fall into this trap. She respected Nadia far too much, and her integrity was all she had left. Hassan was married, and no matter what he said, she could never betray that trust. She wasn't like him. She wasn't just another one of his toys. The days passed in an uncomfortable silence. Leila avoided Hassan as much as she could, keeping her head down and focusing on her work. She stayed out of his way, kept her distance, but Hassan seemed to be everywhere. He was constantly around, always finding an excuse to speak with her. He would pass by her while she cleaned, making small talk, his voice laced with a subtle tension. It was clear he wasn't ready to let things go. Then, one evening, as the house was quiet and Nadia had gone out for another one of her social events, Hassan found her again. This time, she was alone in the living room, dusting the furniture. The air between them felt charged, as if something unspoken was hanging in the space. Leila tried to ignore him, continuing her task, but he wasn't having it. "You can't keep running from me, Leila." Hassan's voice broke through the silence, smooth and low. Leila froze, her body tensing. She didn't want to turn around, but she had no choice. Slowly, she looked up to find him standing just a few feet away, his eyes dark and intense. The look in them sent a shiver down her spine. "I'm not running from you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, though inside her heart was pounding. "Oh, I think you are," Hassan said with a small, almost predatory smile. He took a step forward, and Leila instinctively stepped back, her heart racing. "You can't deny it. I see the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching." She swallowed hard, trying to hold her ground. "I don't know what you mean." Hassan laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "You don't have to pretend, Leila. I know you want this just as much as I do." His words were like daggers, cutting through her resolve. She didn't want this, didn't want him. She had to stop this before it went any further, but the power he wielded over her was undeniable. "I'm not like that," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't want anything from you." Hassan's smile faded, replaced by something darker. He stepped closer, closing the gap between them. "You don't get to decide that, Leila," he said, his voice now a whisper, but one that was full of dangerous promise. "You'll want me in the end. You have no choice." Before she could protest, his lips were on hers. The kiss was sudden, forceful, and it caught her off guard. Leila's body froze, her mind screaming for her to push him away, but her body didn't respond. It was as if time itself had stopped, and she was suspended in this moment where everything was wrong but nothing could be undone. She pushed him away, finally finding the strength to break free. "No, Hassan!" she cried, stepping back, her chest heaving with panic. "I won't let you do this. You're married. You have a wife." Hassan's eyes darkened, and for a brief moment his expression faltered. But then he took a deep breath and regained his composure, his gaze hardening. "You're right. I am married. But Nadia doesn't care for me the way you do. She doesn't understand me like you do." Leila's mind raced, her heart in turmoil. She had to leave. She couldn't stay in this house, not with him. She was a woman of integrity, a woman who valued respect above all else. Hassan had crossed a line, and she couldn't let herself be dragged into this affair. "I won't do this," Leila said firmly, shaking her head. "You can't make me." But Hassan wasn't listening. He stepped closer again, his voice low and threatening. "If you tell anyone about this, Leila, I'll make sure you regret it. No one will believe you. Not after everything I've done for you." Leila froze, his words sinking in like a stone in her chest. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm a powerful man, Leila," Hassan said, his tone cold and menacing. "I can ruin you. I can destroy everything you have. So think carefully about your next move." Fear gripped Leila's heart. She had never felt so powerless in her life. She was trapped, caught between a man who could destroy her and a life she had worked so hard to build. She didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. She couldn't stay in this house any longer. She had to leave. But as she turned to walk away, Hassan grabbed her arm, pulling her back towards him. "Don't forget what I told you," he warned, his grip tight around her wrist. "You'll regret it if you leave." Leila couldn't take it anymore. She wrenched herself free from his grip and ran. She didn't stop until she was in her small room, locked away from him. She sat on the bed, her body trembling, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What had just happened? What would she do now? The days after that night felt like a prison to Leila. She couldn't shake the feeling of Hassan's hands on her, the weight of his words lingering in her mind. She had locked herself away in her room, avoiding him at all costs. She spent her time in a daze, going through the motions of her daily duties but never truly present. Each time she passed him in the halls, their eyes would meet, and she would feel a rush of anxiety. Hassan's presence was like a constant shadow over her life, and she couldn't escape it. Nadia had been gone more frequently, spending days away at charity events or out of town for social gatherings. Leila's role in the house had grown even more isolated. With Nadia's absence, Hassan seemed to take a keener interest in her. His lingering glances were harder to avoid, his questions about her well-being more pointed. Leila could sense he was testing her, trying to draw her back into his web. But she had made up her mind. She would keep her distance, no matter what it took. But the fear of what he could do to her if she told anyone about what had happened, the way he could ruin her life, never left her thoughts. He had made it clear that he was a man of power, someone who could destroy her, and the more she thought about it, the more the weight of his words pressed on her chest. How could she possibly fight back? What could she do? She had no one to turn to, no one who would understand her pain. That is, until the moment everything changed. One afternoon, when the house was particularly quiet, Leila felt an intense nausea wash over her. She had been feeling strange for a while now, tired, dizzy, nauseous, but she had dismissed it as stress or fatigue. She had pushed her emotions down for so long, trying to focus on work, but now something was different. She couldn't ignore the feeling any longer. It was like a knot in her stomach, something far deeper than mere exhaustion. She made her way to the small pharmacy near the mansion, hoping to find some medicine that would ease the discomfort. She told herself it was just a temporary illness, that nothing more serious could be wrong. But as she stood in the aisle, staring at the pregnancy tests, the reality hit her like a ton of bricks. A baby. Her heart stopped for a moment, the weight of the thought crashing down on her. There was no other explanation. Her body had been changing, responding in ways she couldn't deny. The nausea, the fatigue, it all made sense now. She was pregnant, and the father was Hassan. She bought the test, returned home, and locked herself in her room. She didn't need to take the test to know the truth. The possibility of it haunted her every second of the day, but now there was no denying it. She had made a terrible mistake, and now she was carrying the consequences of that mistake. The thought of telling Hassan terrified her. What would he do? What would he say? Would he even acknowledge it? Leila's mind raced as she thought through every possible outcome. She could never keep this child. She didn't have the resources to raise a baby on her own, especially in the circumstances she was in, and yet, something inside her refused to give up. There was a part of her that felt a deep, almost primal need to protect this child. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't her fault either. But this baby was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, everything she had tried to escape from. She needed time to think, time to plan her next move. But Hassan wouldn't give her that time. He had already begun to notice the changes in her, the subtle signs that something was different. He approached her more often now, his presence more insistent. He would make small talk, ask questions about her well-being, and every time he did, Leila felt her heart race in panic. Did he know? Could he tell? One evening, as Leila was preparing dinner, she felt his presence behind her. She stiffened, trying to keep her composure as she continued chopping vegetables. Hassan leaned against the doorway, his eyes fixed on her. "Are you feeling all right, Leila?" he asked, his voice laced with an odd mixture of concern and something darker. "I'm fine," she replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, that's all." He studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't look fine. You've been acting strange lately. I know something's wrong." Leila's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't hide the truth from him forever. Hassan had a way of seeing through people, of getting into their heads. He had a way of making them feel exposed, vulnerable. And now, Leila felt as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice, ready to fall into a pit she couldn't escape. "I'm just not feeling well," she repeated, turning back to her work. But Hassan wasn't convinced. He stepped into the room, his eyes never leaving her face. "You can't hide it from me, Leila. I know you better than that." For a moment, Leila thought he might figure it out, that he might already know the truth. Her hands trembled as she set down the knife and turned to face him. "I'm not hiding anything," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming her. "Don't lie to me, Leila," he whispered, his breath warm on her face. "I know something's different, and I know it has to do with me." The truth was right there, hanging between them like a thick, suffocating fog. Leila felt as if she might break down at any moment, her body betraying her as her emotions surged. But she held herself together, refusing to give him the satisfaction of knowing what she was hiding. "Whatever it is, it's nothing for you to worry about," Leila said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Please, Hassan, I just want to work and do my job." Hassan was silent for a moment, his gaze searching hers. Then, with a heavy sigh, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. But Leila knew that this wouldn't be the last time he tried to uncover her secret. And, as the days passed, the weight of what was happening became unbearable. She had to find a way to protect herself, to protect her child. And she knew that the only way to do that was to fight back. The days stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Leila could no longer pretend that nothing had changed. Her body was a constant reminder of the secret she carried, a secret that was impossible to ignore. Every time she passed Hassan in the halls, she felt the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. He watched her like a hawk, his eyes constantly scanning her, his presence like a shadow that followed her every move. She could sense that he knew something was wrong, but he hadn't pressed her for the truth. Not yet. But every day, the fear gnawed at her. Every time he looked at her, she wondered if he could see the truth written in her eyes. And every time Nadia left for her charity events, Leila felt as though she were being left alone with a dangerous predator. The loneliness of it all was suffocating. She couldn't trust anyone. Not even her closest friends in the city. No one could know what had happened. She was too afraid of what would happen if she told. But Hassan's gaze was relentless. He wasn't going to let her hide forever. Leila knew that deep down he was waiting for her to crack, waiting for her to confess. The game had begun, and he was playing it with cold precision. It was late one evening when Leila's worst fear became a reality. Nadia had gone to a gala that night, leaving Leila to handle the house. Hassan had spent the day in his office, but as the night wore on, Leila could hear the soft sounds of his footsteps in the hallway. She didn't want to face him. She couldn't. But somehow, she knew he was coming for her. The knock on the door came around midnight. Leila froze in place. She had been sitting at the small desk in her room, trying to distract herself with a book, but now, her heartbeat quickened as the knock echoed through the stillness of the house. She tried to ignore it, hoping it was just her imagination, but the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Taking a deep breath, she stood and walked to the door. She opened it slowly, her stomach churning with dread. Hassan stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the threshold. He was dressed casually, but his eyes held the same intense, predatory look. "Leila," he said, his voice low and calm, though it carried an edge she couldn't ignore. "I need to talk to you." Leila's pulse quickened and she instinctively took a step back, trying to put as much space between them as possible. "There's nothing to talk about, Mr. Al-Mansour. I'm very tired. I think you should go back to your room." Hassan's eyes darkened, and he stepped into her room without waiting for an invitation. His presence filled the small space, and Leila suddenly felt cornered, trapped in the four walls that had always felt like her sanctuary. "I don't think you understand, Leila," he said, his voice cold. "I've been patient with you. I've given you space, but I can see it now. You're hiding something from me, and I won't tolerate it." Leila's breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the desk. She had no idea how much he knew, but she could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. "I'm not hiding anything," she said, though her voice betrayed her. "I've been working. That's all. I'm just tired, that's all." Hassan moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're lying," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And I don't like being lied to." He reached out, gently but firmly taking her chin in his hand, forcing her to meet his gaze. His touch was cold, like ice. Leila's heart was pounding in her chest, and she could barely breathe under the intensity of his stare. "Tell me, Leila," he said softly. "What's going on? What have you been hiding from me?" For a moment, Leila thought she might break down right there, that she might confess everything in a rush of fear and emotion. But no, she couldn't let him win. She couldn't let him control her life any more than he already had. "I have nothing to tell you," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "I'm just tired, that's all. Please leave me alone." Hassan's expression shifted. He didn't release her chin, but instead he leaned in closer, his lips brushing against her ear. His breath was warm, sending a shiver down her spine. "You can keep hiding it if you want," he whispered. "But I know what's happening. I know what's going on with you." Leila's heart skipped a beat. Did he know? Did he know about the baby? "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Just leave me alone." He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he pulled back, looking at her with a strange mixture of curiosity and something darker, something dangerous. "You're not fooling anyone, Leila," he said, his tone soft but cold. "I know about you and me. I know what happened, and I'm not going to let you run away from it. Not now, not ever." Leila's mind was reeling, her pulse racing. How much did he know? How long had he been watching her? "I'm not running from anything," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, just let me go. I don't want this anymore. I don't want you." For a long moment, Hassan stood there, staring at her. His gaze was unblinking, searching her face, looking for some sign of weakness, some crack in her facade. But Leila stood her ground, despite the way her heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't let him break her. Finally, Hassan stepped back, his eyes narrowing. He turned and walked to the door, but just before he left, he looked back over his shoulder. "I'll give you some time, Leila," he said softly, the edge to his voice unmistakable. "But don't think for a second that you can keep running from this. You'll have to face me sooner or later." As the door closed behind him, Leila felt the walls closing in. She had never been so afraid in her life. Hassan wasn't just a man with power. He was a man who could destroy everything. And now, with the weight of her secret bearing down on her, Leila knew that the time for hiding was over. The silence that followed Hassan's departure was suffocating. Leila sat on her bed, frozen, unable to move. Her mind was a storm of confusion and fear. What did Hassan mean when he said he knew about them? How much did he truly know? Was he just bluffing, trying to get inside her head, or was he telling the truth? She had never felt so exposed. She had tried so hard to keep her secret, to shield herself from the consequences of that one terrible mistake. But now, she couldn't escape the feeling that Hassan was closing in on her, pushing her toward a cliff she wasn't sure she could avoid. The next few days passed in a blur. Leila tried her best to carry out her duties as usual, but it was impossible to focus. Every time she caught a glimpse of Hassan, her heart would race. He hadn't confronted her again, but she knew it was only a matter of time before he did. The tension between them was unbearable, and each passing moment only made it worse. It was Nadia who first noticed something was off. "Leila, you seem distant," Nadia commented one afternoon as they sat together in the living room. Her voice was casual, but there was a hint of concern in her tone. "Is everything okay?" Leila froze. She had been so careful to hide her feelings, to push them down and pretend everything was fine. But Nadia knew her too well. Nadia had always been intuitive, and now Leila could see the subtle shift in her eyes. She was watching Leila closely, like a hawk circling its prey. "I'm fine," Leila said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired, I suppose. Nothing to worry about." Nadia didn't look convinced. She studied Leila for a long moment, as if trying to read her. Finally, she sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me. I'm always here." Leila nodded, but inside she felt a wave of guilt crash over her. She couldn't tell Nadia the truth. She couldn't burden her with the secrets that weighed so heavily on her heart. Nadia had enough to deal with already, but what if Hassan wasn't the only one who could uncover her secret? What if Nadia found out? Would she believe her? Or would she turn against her, just like Hassan had? The fear of being exposed was overwhelming. That night, after Nadia had gone to bed, Leila found herself alone in the kitchen. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that filled the otherwise quiet house. Her hands were trembling as she ran water over the dishes, trying to drown out the noise in her mind. Suddenly, she felt a presence behind her. She turned quickly, her heart leaping into her throat. Hassan was standing in the doorway, his eyes locked on her with that same intensity. "I thought you were asleep," Leila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't sleep," Hassan replied, his voice cold. "I've been thinking about our little conversation earlier, about what you've been hiding." Leila's pulse quickened, and she felt the familiar knot of panic tighten in her chest. She couldn't let him get inside her head again. She had to stay strong, no matter how terrifying the situation had become. "I don't know what you're talking about," Leila said, trying to sound confident. There's nothing to hide." Hassan's gaze hardened, and he stepped closer, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I know something's wrong, Leila, and you're going to tell me what it is." Leila's mind raced. She couldn't tell him the truth. She couldn't tell him about the baby, about the mistake that had already begun to haunt her every waking moment. But what if he found out anyway? What if he used it against her, just like he had warned? "I don't have anything to tell you," she said, her voice shaking now despite her best efforts. Hassan stepped even closer, his presence overwhelming. "We both know that's not true. I'm giving you one last chance to tell me the truth, Leila." Her heart was pounding in her chest, and for a moment she wondered if she might pass out from the weight of the fear pressing down on her. She couldn't bear it anymore. She couldn't stand the thought of him controlling her life, of holding this secret over her head forever. But in the same breath, she knew that telling him now could destroy everything. Her job, her reputation, her dignity. She couldn't lose all of that, not without a fight. I can't," Leila whispered, looking down at her hands. "Please, Hassan, please don't do this." Hassan's eyes softened for a moment, but only for a second. Then, his lips curled into a smile, one that sent a chill down Leila's spine. "You'll come to me when you're ready," he said, turning on his heel and walking away. As the sound of his footsteps faded down the hallway, Leila sank to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She felt completely and utterly trapped. Hassan knew something was wrong, but she had no way of stopping him from finding out everything. There was no more running, no more hiding. The truth would come out, and when it did, she wasn't sure if she'd be able to survive the fallout. Leila woke the next morning with a sinking feeling in her chest. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't escape. Hassan had left her alone for now, but she knew it wouldn't last. The game was getting more dangerous, and she felt herself being pulled deeper into it with every passing hour. The day began like any other, but Leila couldn't focus. She moved through her usual tasks mechanically, her mind consumed by thoughts of the secret she was carrying and the way Hassan had cornered her in the kitchen the night before. She had thought she could control the situation, keep her distance, but now everything seemed out of her hands. As she cleaned the living room, the echo of her footsteps on the marble floor seemed to mock her. She could hear her own heartbeat thumping in her ears, the silence in the house heavy with anticipation. What was Hassan planning? Was he waiting for her to break, or was he preparing for something worse? The house felt increasingly like a cage, the walls closing in on her. Leila longed for an escape, for a way out of this twisted game, but the reality was that she had nowhere to go. Hassan held all the power, and he was tightening his grip around her, slowly but surely. The clock struck noon when Nadia returned from her charity event, and Leila felt a brief moment of relief. Nadia's presence, for all the unease that came with it, offered a semblance of normalcy. She could pretend, at least for a few hours, that everything was fine. She could hide behind the familiar rhythm of serving tea, making lunch, and exchanging polite pleasantries. But even as she sat across from Nadia at the dining table, she could feel the pressure mounting. Nadia was watching her more closely than usual, her gaze lingering a little too long as if she could see right through Leila's mask. Leila forced a smile, pushing the rising panic down deep within herself. "You're awfully quiet today," Nadia remarked, stirring her tea. "Is everything all right, Leila?" "Everything's fine," Leila replied quickly, the words coming out too fast, too forced. She hated the sound of her own voice, the way it wavered. But there was no turning back now. "Are you sure?" Nadia pressed, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You've been acting different lately. If something's wrong, you know you can tell me." Leila swallowed, the lump in her throat growing. She couldn't tell Nadia. Not about this, she couldn't risk it. If Hassan found out that Nadia knew, it would be over for both of them. He would destroy everything. "I'm just tired," Leila said, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been working a lot, that's all." Nadia looked unconvinced, but she didn't press the matter further. Instead, she changed the subject, talking about a new project she was involved in. Leila tried to focus on the conversation, to escape the weight of the secret pressing against her chest. But no matter how hard she tried, her mind kept returning to the same terrifying question. What would happen if Hassan found out? Later that evening, Leila found herself alone in the kitchen once again, washing dishes in silence. The house was dark now, the only light coming from the soft glow of the refrigerator and the distant glow of streetlights outside. She tried to focus on the simple task at hand, but her mind kept racing. How long could she keep running from the truth? Hassan wasn't going to let her go. He was a man who took what he wanted, when he wanted it. And right now, he wanted her to confess. Suddenly, Leila froze. She heard the familiar sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, almost too quiet. She turned her head, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Hassan. She could feel his presence before she even saw him. His shadow fell across the kitchen floor as he stepped into the doorway, and for a moment they simply stood there in silence, the tension between them almost palpable. "Leila," he said, his voice low and controlled. "We need to talk." Her breath hitched and she instinctively stepped back, trying to put distance between them. "There's nothing to talk about," she said, her voice shaking. "I've already told you everything." Hassan didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on her, unwavering. "You're lying to me again," he said, his voice darker now, more insistent. "I know you're hiding something, and I'm not going to let you keep running from it." Leila's mind raced, panic rising in her chest. She couldn't face him, not now, not with everything at stake, but she knew he wasn't going to stop. He would keep pressing until she gave him what he wanted. "I'm not lying," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm just tired. Please, Hassan, leave me alone." Hassan stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've been lying to yourself, Leila," he said softly. "You can't hide from me forever. I know what's going on." The words hit her like a slap to the face. For a moment, Leila stood there, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't run anymore. The truth was closing in on her, and Hassan knew it. "You know what?" Leila said, her voice suddenly steady, despite the fear twisting in her gut. "You're right. I'm hiding something. But it's not what you think." Hassan's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of curiosity passing through them. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I'm not hiding anything from you. I'm hiding from myself," Leila said, her voice stronger now, as if the words had been building inside her for months. "I'm hiding from the fear of what you'll do when you find out the truth you've been so desperate to uncover." Hassan stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "And what truth is that, Leila?" For a moment, Leila hesitated, her mind racing. She had already started this, and there was no turning back now. She had to say it. She had to confront him. "I'm pregnant," she said quietly, the words hanging in the air between them. Hassan's expression didn't change. He didn't speak. For what felt like an eternity, he simply stood there, staring at her. Then slowly, he exhaled, his eyes narrowing. "Well then," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. "I think it's time we had a real conversation, don't you?" The silence that followed Hassan's revelation felt suffocating. Leila stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. The words she had so carefully avoided were now hanging between them, their weight more crushing than she had ever imagined. Hassan's cold stare drilled into her, and for a moment Leila wondered if she might collapse from the sheer pressure of the situation. "You're pregnant," Hassan repeated, his voice cold and calculating. "And you didn't think to tell me sooner?" Leila's heart skipped a beat. The venom in his tone was palpable, each word hitting her like a lash. "I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what you would do." Hassan took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "What do you think I would do, Leila? What do you think I should do now?" His eyes narrowed as he studied her, trying to gauge her reaction. "You've been keeping a secret from me, from all of us. You think I won't hold that against you?" Leila recoiled, instinctively taking a step back, but there was nowhere to retreat. She felt trapped, cornered by her own fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but found herself speechless, unsure of what to say. She had already made so many mistakes, and now the consequences were unfolding before her eyes. "I didn't want this," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "I never wanted any of this to happen." The truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Leila had never asked for this. She had never wanted to be in this position, caught between a powerful man who could ruin her and the life inside her that she could never undo. Hassan's gaze softened, but only for a fleeting moment. "You think this is just about you, don't you? You think you're the only one affected by this?" Leila's heart ached as his words cut through her. "What do you want from me, Hassan?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What do you want me to say? You've already made it clear what you think of me. What do you want me to do now?" Hassan stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm in an almost intimate gesture. "I want you to understand something, Leila," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't have a choice anymore. You never did. You're mine now." Leila recoiled from his touch, the words hitting her like a slap. "I'm not yours, Hassan," she said, her voice firm despite the shaking in her chest. "I never was." Hassan's face darkened, his eyes flashing with fury. "You don't get to make demands here. You're not in a position to negotiate." His words sent a chill down her spine, but Leila didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to be afraid anymore. She had already lost too much. "I didn't ask for any of this, Hassan, and I won't let you control me, not now, not ever." The room fell silent, the tension between them so thick that it felt like the walls were closing in. Hassan stood there for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally he spoke, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "You'll regret this, Leila," he said, his voice a low growl. "You'll regret ever crossing me." With those final words, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Leila standing there, her heart racing, her body trembling with fear and anger. She had never felt so powerless in her life. And yet, deep down, something within her stirred, a defiance that hadn't been there before. She was done hiding, done running. But what could she do now? What options did she have left? Hassan was a man of power, a man who could destroy her with a single word. She had no allies, no one she could turn to. And the life she was carrying, her child, was a constant reminder of her captivity. The days that followed were a blur. Leila did her best to avoid Hassan, but the tension between them was palpable. He had made his feelings clear, and she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. She felt like a prisoner in her own life, trapped in a web of secrets and lies, unable to escape the man who controlled everything. But, as much as she tried to stay in the background, she knew that she couldn't hide forever, and the longer she stayed silent, the more dangerous it became. It was then that Leila made a decision. She couldn't keep living this way. She couldn't let Hassan dictate her life any longer. She had to take control, even if it meant risking everything. But she knew that Hassan would not go down without a fight. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, and Leila understood that he would stop at nothing to maintain his power. There was only one way to fight back, one way to show Hassan that she wasn't just his pawn to control. Leila had to find her voice, and when the time came, she would make sure that everyone knew the truth. Days passed in a haze of tension. Leila couldn't avoid Hassan forever, but she was determined to find a way to take back control. Every moment spent in his presence felt like a battle, but she was biding her time. She began to quietly gather evidence, keeping notes, recording conversations, anything she could use against him. Hassan had underestimated her, thinking she was just a quiet, subservient domestic worker. He didn't know the woman she had become in silence. One evening, as she scrubbed the floors in the grand hall, Leila overheard Hassan talking to one of his business associates on the phone. He spoke with an arrogance that made her blood boil, dismissing his own family, manipulating deals. She heard it all, every word. But more importantly, she realized something. The more Hassan controlled her, the more vulnerable he became. Leila knew it was time to act. Leila's heart raced as she walked into the lavish ballroom, clutching a small, discreet device in her hand. The party was in full swing, guests laughing, music playing, but Leila knew that everything would change in the next few moments. She approached the stage, where Hassan stood, oblivious. With trembling fingers, she pressed play. The room went quiet as the audio of Hassan's voice from the conversation she'd recorded filled the space. His secrets, his lies, echoed in the silence. Everyone turned, shocked. Hassan froze. His face drained of color. The truth was out. The room was still. Hassan's eyes widened in disbelief, his secrets exposed. Guests murmured, confused. Leila stepped forward, her voice steady. "This man has betrayed all of you," she said, turning to face the crowd, "and me." Hassan tried to speak, but his words faltered. The damage was done. He was finished. Hassan's pride shattered. He glared at Leila, but she didn't flinch. "You thought I'd stay silent forever?" she asked. "This is my revenge." The room buzzed with whispers, everyone watching, waiting for his next move. Hassan, defeated, turned and walked away, unable to face the consequences of his actions. Leila stood tall, the weight of the past lifting off her shoulders. She had won. The truth was out, and Hassan's empire crumbled. The guests began to leave, still stunned, but Leila felt a sense of freedom. Her life was no longer controlled by fear. She had taken back her power. Wow, what an intense journey, right? Leila's courage, Hassan's downfall. This story is full of twists and emotions that you won't soon forget. But we want to hear from you. What do you think? Was Leila's revenge justified, or did she go too far? How would you have handled the situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Every perspective matters, and your voice could help others see this story in a whole new light. Don't forget to like, share, and hit that notification bell for more gripping stories like this one. Your opinion means everything to us.